Yeah, it's difficult to know exactly where to start because it's become, I think the fire hose of news is
Yeah.
kind of what's going on here.
You would have to nuke the EU and start up, like reboot it.
Wow. Wow. It's always been my biggest fear of Ukraine is it would just turn into Chechnya and you'll just see Ukraine pummeled into the ground and eventually some sort of stooge will take over and sort of turn it into a satellite state of Russia.
Yeah.
Secrets and Spies presents Espresso Martini with Chris Carr and Matt Fulton.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Espresso Martini. Matt, how are you?
I'm doing good, Chris. How are you? It's good to be back from our little spring break.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Had a nice little Easter break, plenty of chocolate and a bit of barbecuing. How about yourself?
Yeah, same. It was low key, chill. Same kind of usual people were there. No offense to anyone who was involved in my Easter. Yours looked a lot more exciting from the pictures that I saw.
Well, I was the official photographer of mine. It was actually my wife's cousin's 30th birthday, so it became quite a big event, the Easter, and a lot of barbecuing took place that, gosh, it took about, how much? Oh, God, we cooked a lot of chicken that day, and I've lost track. I felt like it was about 2 hours of cooking straight, I think, is
Wow.
what we achieved that day. So, yeah, but there's plenty of photographs of everything, and I was testing out a new flash gun and blinding everybody, but managing to get quite good flattering pictures of everybody.
Nice.
So that was good.
Nice.
That was cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, we've got an interesting episode lined up, haven't we? So we've got a bit more on Pete Hegseth and Signalgate. We've got some information on a Russian spy who's been leading negotiations in the ongoing, and I'll call it so-called peace talks to end Russia's war on Ukraine. And then we've got some listener questions to finish us off today. So let us kick off with the Pete Hegseth Signalgate, which one you've been following, Matt. So yeah, I'll let you tell us about this.
Yeah, so this is this segment here is going to be a bit of a amalgamation of a whole bunch of stories recently that have been swirling around Pete Hegseth and his tenure as Secretary of Defense since we've been away. Some of it's fallout from Signalgate, some of it are other, internal office squabbling and stuff. This is one of those stories where preparing for it is one of those, like, I could have just kept sending you link after link after link for the last few days. Like, we're going to add this and this.
Oh, I know. It's difficult to keep track.
Yeah, it's a moving target. And so I'm sure this is one of the cases where, by the time this episode airs, there will be some maybe new context or information out there. I, for one, would be shocked if he was not still Secretary of Defense by this time the episode airs. But anyway, so here's sort of where we are. So
give it our best stab, yeah.
Yes. As of this recording on Thursday morning here on the East Coast. So the scandals surrounding Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has deepened, throwing the Pentagon into chaos and raising new questions about his fitness to lead. After initially coming under fire for sharing sensitive details of U.S. airstrikes in Yemen in a Signal group chat that inadvertently included the Atlantic's editor-in-chief, covered that plenty on here. It's now emerged that Hegseth disclosed the same strike plans down to the launch times of U.S. fighter jets in a second Signal chat with his wife, brother, and personal attorney. None of them had any clear operational need to know the information. The details were first relayed to Hegseth by General Michael Kurilla, head of U.S. Central Command over Secure Military Communication System. Within minutes, Hegseth took that information and sent it out over Signal using his personal phone, despite internal warnings beforehand not to do so. The fallout has been swift and destabilizing. At least 3 top Hegseth aides have been fired or escorted from the building in recent weeks over allegations of leaking to the press, and others are considering resigning. Reports describe screaming matches in Hegseth inner circle, bureaucratic gridlock, and a general distrust of Pentagon staffers, some of whom, these are career Pentagon staffers, some of whom have been asked to prove their patriotism through resume reviews even after serving in Iraq and Afghanistan. Meanwhile, Defense Department priorities like Trump's, quote, Iron Dome for America have stalled an Elon Musk cost-cutting crusade to slash up to 200,000 civilian defense jobs has only added to the dysfunction. While the Trump White House insists Hegseth still has the president's full support, the chorus of concern is growing louder. GOP Rep. Don Bacon has become the first from Trump's own party to publicly call for Hegseth resignation, telling Axios, if a Democrat did this, we'd be demanding a scalp. I don't like hypocrisy. We should be Americans first when it comes to security. And a bipartisan push from the Senate Armed Services Committee has prompted a DOD Inspector General review into whether Hegseth violated security protocols. On Monday, NPR reported that the White House was looking for Hegseth's replacement. According to a U.S. official who was not authorized to speak publicly, the White House has denied this. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt posted on Twitter that President Trump stands strongly behind him. For now, Hegseth remains defiant, blaming the media and disgruntled former employees, even as the walls close in and questions about his fitness for office grows. Chris, what do you think about this?
Yeah, it's difficult to know exactly where to start because it's become, I think the fire hose of news is kind of what's going on here. There's so many things from so many angles. It's getting harder and harder to keep track of it. And it's only been, how long has he been Defense Secretary? 6 weeks or?
No, we're coming up on 100 days. We're coming up on 100 days. So it was a little bit less than that. I forget exactly when in February he would have been. He was officially confirmed, but under 100 days he's been in office.
Yeah, and it's just been crazy. So, I mean, one of the things that stood out for me, I mean, we've sort of talked about this previously with the whole Signal Gate scandal, but there's an addendum to the scandal now where apparently he'd been messaging his wife and brother on his personal phone, with like minute by minute classified information about these airstrikes, which is a big no-no, isn't it? Because if you use your personal phone, it's, especially as defense secretary, highly likely to be a target of foreign intelligence.
Right.
And no matter how secure Signal is, I'm assuming that it doesn't matter because if they've got access to your phone, they can kind of just read the screen, can't they, with the various technologies out there? Yeah,
I mean, if you when we had Shane Harris on a couple of weeks ago to talk about, Signal Gate 1.0, this is a question we asked him directly, how easy would it be for a foreign intelligence services, not to say, a major hostile foreign service such as the Russians or the Chinese, to compromise a personal phone of a senior cabinet official, if they weren't taking the right precautions to do so. And it's fairly easy. I mean, there's Israeli software programs that have been developed that you can buy if you have the resources. They're not cheap, but hey, we're talking about nation states here. You can even buy that off the shelf. It's not like you have to have, specific Russian or Chinese programs or software to do. And, those services no doubt have their own stuff. But to just underscore that point, you can buy commercially available software to, burrow into someone's phone and just, sit there and read the activity. That's completely possible.
Yeah. Or hire even a company to do it for you, which is staffed by former spies, as has been happening in Qatar, I believe. Certainly, I know in London there's certain private spy firms that have connections to all sorts of stuff. So, with the right money, you can get it whatever you want. So this is, I remember asking Shane, well, what's the sort of standard thing that's supposed to happen in this situation? And usually a person would be investigated and heavily reprimanded, or they'd be made to resign. And I think that Hegseth, the longer he stays in, it's making it harder and harder for Americans' allies to justify sharing sensitive information because you've got somebody who is clearly not being good with classified information. You've got also, it sets a bad precedent for future cases involving breaches of classified information, because if you don't hold Hegseth to account, then people can always sort of cite him as an excuse for how they should be dealt with. And then for members of the military, I also wonder how they can have faith in the operational security of critical and dangerous missions that they're asked to undertake for the US government. Because if the head of the Pentagon is just, shooting the shit with his family members, saying, oh my God, look at what we're doing, isn't this great, kind of thing, he's putting those lives at risk. And they're very lucky that with regards to the Yemen strike, I think I said this before, I don't believe the Yemeni... the Houthis, sorry, I don't believe the Houthis got any word of the strike prior to it happening, which is more luck than anything.
We have no, there's no indication out in the open that the Houthis did know of these strikes in advance, or that potentially, a third country such as Russia or China had knowledge of this in advance because of this. We don't know that. But again, to your point, just because we don't know, it doesn't mean it didn't happen. And also, if not, it's purely just by chance and kind of the grace of God that it didn't happen, And of course, all those services and all those, just one more point here, all those services know. If you want to know what's going on, maybe try and get inside Pete Hegseth's personal cell phone if they didn't think of that already.
Exactly. And in fact, there was an article which I've completely only just remembered and forgot about my prep, so forgive me. But there was something just the other day about how Russian intelligence have been focusing on Signal for some time, trying to penetrate it. So it doesn't surprise me if they already have access via, to Signal via a backdoor or something.
Yeah, and you don't have to. It's not a matter of, accessing a backdoor into Signal servers. You can get onto the device itself and read it from there. It's not, you don't have to necessarily compromise Signal itself to be able to do this.
No, exactly. And this is the thing, leading intelligence service, it could be the NSA, it could be the Russians, it could be the British. There are ways for them to penetrate pretty much any app from WhatsApp to Signal to Telegram if they want to. Encryption's not perfect, and obviously with AI it's probably getting even easier to break through encryption now, because if you have an AI that's just dedicated to breaking encryption codes, surely it's almost near impossible to keep a secret any longer. But that's for maybe people with greater knowledge than I do to answer whether that's the case or not. But it's still, I think it must be very hard for any member of the military to really have faith in leadership if this is sort of going on. And there was a really great opinion piece in Politico by John Uliott titled "The Month from Hell Inside the Agency," which is the Pentagon, not the CIA. I'm not quite sure they're called the agency, but there we go. Uliott worked for the Pentagon for 1 month under Hegseth as chief Pentagon spokesperson. And Uliott was a big supporter of Hegseth and felt that he was the best candidate for the job to shake things up at the Pentagon, which were his words and not mine. And Uliott reports that there's been a near collapse inside the Pentagon's top ranks. And despite his loyalty to Hegseth, he actually feels that the last month at the Pentagon has been a full-blown meltdown, and it's becoming a real problem for the administration. As he says, there was Signal gates. Then there's been a situation in which Hegseth has been bringing his wife to sensitive meetings, and I'll go into that a little bit more in a sec. We've got the, Pentagon set up a top secret meeting for Elon Musk on China, which was a big no-no and deeply problematic because of Musk's business ties to China. And then we've got staffing purges as well, which is obviously causing all sorts of issues. And institutional knowledge is being lost as people get fired or walk out the door.
Right.
So Uliott is very much a Trump loyalist, and he's still a friend of Hegseth, even though he might not be after that Politico article. But if you do read the piece, keep those bits in mind. Now, he brought up Hegseth's wife, Jennifer Hegseth, and she has apparently been in sensitive meetings. And she was also included in Hegseth's additional Signal messages that included the war plans. And CNN wrote an interesting piece asking why she is with him at the Pentagon, especially as she has no national security background and no reported security clearance at this time, which makes her presence highly unusual. Now, CNN report that multiple sources have said that Pete Hegseth has grown increasingly paranoid about the potential of leaks to the media within the Pentagon and has begun largely depending on a small circle for counsel, including his wife. Now, Jennifer apparently attended at least one official meeting of her husband. She joined him in a bilateral meeting at the Pentagon in March between Hegseth and UK Defence Secretary John Healey. Officials have stated that she exited the meeting before any sensitive or classified discussions occur, and I will hope that's accurate, but we don't know for sure. One official said that I have never seen in my professional life a spouse sit in on a meeting with counterparts from other countries where they talk through sensitive matters related to our relationship with foreign militaries. Both her presence in the Healey meeting and her inclusion on the Signal chain where Hegseth was discussing military operations could raise concerns among foreign leaders about Hegseth's ability to keep sensitive information to himself, said Greg Williams, who is the director of the Project on Government's Oversight Center for Defense Information. Williams also went on to say it raises serious concerns that Hegseth doesn't understand the boundaries between his personal life and his professional life. And the strength and safety of the United States depends very heavily on, your relationship with close allies. And if they don't believe that the defense secretary has a reasonable understanding of boundaries between his personal life and professional life, it will be very difficult for them to share sensitive information. And then just one final bit, the Daily Mail, which is obviously not the most reliable source, but sometimes their defense stuff can be quite good. But they report that Jennifer Hegseth has earned the nickname Yoko Ono. And the Mail went on to report that the sources who spoke to the Daily Mail said that Hegseth relies on his wife to prepare and supervise him like she did behind the scenes on Fox News.
She's a former Fox producer.
Yeah, and she apparently has to keep an eye on his sobriety, and maybe also from his wandering eyes and making sure his pants are zipped, apparently. So make of that what you will. So
woke Daily Mail, the woke liberal Daily Mail said this?
No, the Daily Mail said that,
wow.
Yeah.
Must be a cold day in hell today.
Yeah. Well, I think J.D. Vance ruined the Daily Mail relationship with the Trump administration.
Oh, good point.
So yeah, it's crazy stuff, really. So what are your thoughts on all of this?
Yeah, okay. There's, as you said, there's so much.
Yoko Ono aside.
Yeah, that really threw me. I did not know that. I reacted to that in real time for sure. No, it's true though. I can see that. Anyway, I'm thinking back to some friends groups and stuff that I had before where there was a Yoko situation and it was not good. The Yoko situations in your friends group never goes well. And none of those guys that I'm thinking of were ever Secretary of Defense. Anyway, yeah, so let's go back to Signalgate 2.0 and sort of unpack that one a bit, right? So there was in the first, Signalgate 1.0 that will say that, the Atlantic broke, and we talked with Shane about that and everything. There was some, I guess, assumptions, suspicions that the really specific, operationally sensitive, if not outright classified, and I don't see how it wouldn't be classified according to, every professional that has sort of commented on this, that really operationally sensitive information, like the specific times that, the F-18s were going to take off from the Truman, I believe it was, that stuff was put into that group chat by Hegseth, right? And it was sort of thought that, or suspected that he had basically, considering, the verbiage and the specificity and the formatting and everything, like he just sort of copy and pasted it directly from, an official, like, high side or classified kind of system, right? And this, Signalgate 2.0 essentially kind of confirms the same thing, so this information came directly from, I don't know specifically what military communication system, but it was, for sure a high side secure system coming from the commander of U.S. Central Command, which, tracks with how the chain of command of the U.S. Armed Forces goes. It's, the president and the Secretary of Defense are jointly considered the National Command Authority, right? So the chain of command goes from goes from the president to the Secretary of Defense directly to the combatant commander that oversees the area of operations where whatever's happening is going on, right? Which in this case is CENTCOM. The Joint Chiefs sort of play a planning, advisory, coordinating role. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs is officially the president's chief military advisor, but he's not in the chain of command, right? So yeah, that completely tracks that you're, about to launch these airstrikes on Yemen, and the commander of CENTCOM would be forwarding this to the Secretary of Defense. I would guess this came through the NMCC and the Pentagon. That's the National Military Command Center. But that's just my hunch. I don't know that for sure, but that's totally normal. Even, I guess, there's the signal part using a commercial a commercially available app that, in Signalgate 1.0, that was Mike Waltz, the national security advisor, who started that. But this one, I think, is just far more egregious because we know that Hegseth now put this into, on his personal phone for sure, a Signal group chat with, you said his wife, who you've talked about, her sort of unusual role in the Department of Defense now. Also, his brother, Phil Hegseth, who officially has the role of he has a job in the, so a lot of what we're talking about here, we're talking about like disorder in the Pentagon, but we're really talking about is the immediate office of the Secretary of Defense, right? So just as an aside here, there's the Office of the Secretary of Defense, which is a huge, sprawling organization that includes a number of undersecretaries and assistant secretaries of defense and deputy assistant secretaries, and it's a huge bureaucracy. And there's all kinds of agencies and services and stuff that kind of feed into it. It's huge. And then you consider on top of that the org chart, the joint staff, the military service departments, so the departments of the Air Force, Army, and the Navy. The Space Force is under the Department of the Air Force officially. Anyway, huge, colossal organization. Like we're talking about like the largest and most complicated corporation essentially in human history, right? But what we're focused on right now is the immediate office of the Secretary of Defense. So Hegseth's core staff, right? So in that, Phil Hegseth, his brother, was named a senior advisor to the secretary and handling liaison duties with the Department of Homeland Security. He has no operational need to know about the exact time planes are launching to bomb Yemen. Nowhere in his job description does that fall in. The other, his personal attorney, Tim Parlatori, I believe is how you say it. But yeah, so previously one of Trump's attorneys also is Hegseth's personal attorney. He was brought back in as a Navy commander by Hegseth and placed in the Judge Advocate General Court to sort of like reform that. But also, no operational need to know what time the planes are taking off to bomb Yemen, right? It's sort of like, it's someone who just gets really excited about doing this for real, and wants to show off. And I think you can see that also in the way Hegseth kind of pushes back against these reports in the media and says, these aren't war plans. I see war plans all the time. I was looking at war plans this morning. I get strike plans all the time. Like, I know exactly what they look like, and that's not what this is. Like, it's just a kind of braggadocious, try hard kind of a thing. Like, okay, so when I was in high school, I did this. I got picked to go do this thing down in DC for a week. It was a National Young Leaders Forum, right? And we got a bunch of people came and talked to us. We toured a bunch of government buildings and everything. And part of it, we did a couple different like war games, right? Of like hypothetical international crisis scenarios, right? And we were all put up in groups. We were all sort of given positions on the National Security Council, and we had to, like war game this crisis scenario. And in all of the ones that we did that week, I was the director of the CIA. Like for the week, I was the director of the CIA. And
how was that? Was it a stressful week?
I loved it. Of course, I'm like 16, I think, and I get pulled out by the advisors of the program, whatever, were like pulling me out to hand me intelligence reports that I had to go back into the president, the guy who was playing the president. And it was, but I remember being a 16-year-old, like, oh my God, like I'm the director of the CIA now. This is so cool. Like we get to actually do this for real, stuff that I was just sort of like academically and personally interested in at the time. That's the same kind of mentality that I see in Hegseth right now. But, if in the middle of that war game, I, whipped out my, Nokia flip phone and texted my buddies back, in chemistry class that morning and go, I forget what the crisis was or something, but hey, I'm the director of the CIA right now, and this is what we're doing. Like, that's not real life, that's not going to get people killed, but that's the kind of mindset that he's in. And it's just very kind of kind of an amateur thing there. I don't know if you would. So that's how I sort of see Signalgate 2.0. I don't know if you want to get more back into the staff dysfunction and stuff as well, but
no, just an image popped into my mind as you were discussing the sort of bravado. There's a really famous photoshopped image of Tony Blair from the Iraq War. So basically the image was Tony Blair standing to a phone of his thumbs up and an explosion behind him. Obviously, it's photoshopped and it was kind of like a protest, but at the same time, it kind of like you could now change that image, but Hegseth there with his phone going, with his explosion behind him because he's loving it. He's clearly loving being, in this position of power, authority, and it's amateur hour. Sadly, I was just thinking, what would Tom Clancy make of all this? Because this is not the sort of thing that would fly in The Hunt for Red October.
I've thought often what Clancy, if he was still around, how he would feel about things. I worry that he would have succumbed to the virus that many other conservative-minded national security people have in recent years, but I don't know. That's a hypothetical question that we don't need to worry about because he's not here. But yes, I can imagine Clancy in the 80s and 90s, the stuff he was talking about, the stuff he believed in. You're not supposed to do these things.
Well, yeah, it made me think about, like, where are the kind of Reagan era Republicans and stuff like that? And I think, like you were just saying about the virus, I think the problem is when it's a slow burn, by the time you get to this point, if you've been on the kind of the MAGA train, none of this is particularly shocking. But if you come in cold, then it is shocking because of the blatant unprofessionalism that's going on and putting people's lives in danger. But it's astonishing that there are people out there who still are defending this stuff in the name of owning the libs or whatever.
Well, so here's, so that's sort of the signal gate is kind of the one speaks to the broader issue of dysfunction and Hegseth's fitness to be Secretary of Defense, but that's sort of one part of this. There's also in recent weeks these leak investigations and everything that have resulted in a few key staffers in Hegseth's immediate office being, fired and escorted out of the building. And a lot of them, John Ulyat is one of them, go to Politico and write op-eds and, knife Hegseth in the back. I mean, that's what you were talking about with Ulyat. I don't doubt that what he's describing is true, but I mean, these are scorpions eating each other.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, totally. And his concern was more about how bad it is for the administration, not for the country.
Right. He's still fully on board with Trump and his priorities and stuff and just wants him to be served better. That's his purpose.
Exactly.
A couple of the people who have been fired. So there's Dan Caldwell, who was a senior advisor to Hegseth. He recently went on Tucker Carlson and was kind of whining about this and saying, oh, it's the deep state boogeyman. And, whenever they bring up the deep state, they're just like, we have no agency against these people. Colin Carroll, who's the chief of staff to the deputy secretary of defense, Darren Selnick, who's Hegseth's deputy chief of staff, and John Ulyat, who you mentioned, who was the assistant for public affairs to the secretary. So, there's also stories in a I believe it's in one of the articles that'll be linked in the show notes. There's issues with Hegseth's own chief of staff, right? Who, nominally runs the whole office of the secretary of defense. So there was an anecdote in there about a staff meeting that he sort of meandered off and started talking about, going to a strip club in D.C. recently with someone else in the staff. I don't think I need to explain to listeners.
Spring break kind of stuff, isn't it?
Should we not aim to be a bit better than this? I don't know, but to these point, Hegseth was asked about it on a Fox News interview recently and saying, yeah, these are all just leakers, once a leaker, always a leaker. And it's sort of like these people who are being, fired and escorted out of the building, these are not deep state functionaries burrowed deep down within the org chart. These are not Biden holdover appointees who are out to, sabotage, the Emperor Trump's great agenda. These are his own people. These are in many cases veterans. I think a lot of them, a few of the people I just named are former Marines, or they're all veterans in some case. Some of them worked with Hegseth at his veterans charity that he ran for a bit before going to Fox News full time. These are his people. So if they're leakers and saboteurs and scumbags, they're leakers and saboteurs and scumbags that Pete Hegseth gave jobs at the top of the Pentagon.
Yeah.
It's total amateur hour. And when you hire an amateur to be the Secretary of Defense to, day-to-day manage the operations and functions of the most powerful military in human history, this is what you get. And to that point, I mean, Hegseth got dragged across the finish line by J.D. Vance. Vance had to come in and break a 50-50 tie in the Senate to get him confirmed, which for a Secretary of Defense, that doesn't happen. Secretaries of Defense, especially even in Trump's first term, are often almost always confirmed almost by unanimous consent or by very large margins. You know? So I don't sort of wrapping up my analysis here. I would be surprised if Hegseth left in the immediate near future. I'm talking about a matter of like days to weeks or something. But I think all of these stories, I mean, Trump personally likes Hegseth still. Hegseth is certainly loyal to Trump. I think Trump likes the whole, central casting thing that Hegseth has as far as what he believes a Secretary of Defense should, look like, which is lethality means like how many push-ups you can do. But I think these are all strikes against Hegseth that are building up. I do not expect him to last. When he will go, I don't know. Like I said, it's not going to be. It's not going to be before. I don't think it's going to be before this episode airs. I don't think it's going to be, by in the next month potentially. Even who knows? But if he was still in office by the end of the summer, I would be honestly surprised. I think it's just not working out. He's not cut for the job.
No. Well, I was just making a note. Incompetence and bravado is more dangerous than anything else. And I think this is where we're at with people like Hegseth.
Yeah. It's a George Smiley quote right there. Could be.
Yeah. And I wonder what else there is, because obviously we've got Signalgate. I'm sure there's something else out there waiting to happen.
Yeah. I mean,
or waiting to be discovered.
Are there more Signal group chats? Are there more,
weren't there 20 plus by I've forgotten his name now.
Mike Waltz? Yeah. That was Waltz. Yeah, for different global issues and everything that the NSC was dealing with. As far as Hegseth, what he's doing with this stuff and other stories about his staff and everything. Oh yeah, I'm sure there's, wolves are circling now. We'll hear more. I'm positive we'll hear more.
Yeah, indeed. Well, on that, let's take a break and be right back with more. Welcome back, everybody. So our next piece is an interesting one from the Kyiv Independent about a Russian spy who's been leading the negotiations in the so-called peace talks going on between the United States, Russia, and Ukraine. So I'll summarize the kind of key points below. So the Russian delegation for these peace talks has been led by a man named Sergei Besarda and another man called Grigory Kasarin, who was the chairman of the Federation Council Committee on International Affairs. But the interesting guy is Sergei Besarda. So he was born on the 17th of May, 1954, and he began his career in the Soviet KGB before transitioning to the FSB following the dissolution of the USSR. In 2003, he was appointed deputy head for the Department of Coordination of Operational Information. And then by 2009, he ascended to lead the Fifth Service. So he was the head of the FSB's Fifth Service from 2009 to 2024, and he played a crucial role in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. His service provided flawed intelligence suggesting that Ukraine would not resist the Russian military, which contributed to Russia's miscalculated confidence in a quick victory. Despite backlash, Besarda has remained with the FSB and is now serving as an advisor. So the FSB's Fifth Service, formerly known as the Service for Operational Information and International Relations, obviously I'll let you translate it to Russian, but is a powerful arm of the Russian Federal Security Service, and it's tasked with foreign intelligence operations, particularly in former Soviet republics. And I believe you talked about them before, Matt.
Yeah.
And unlike the SVR, which handles global espionage, the Fifth Service focuses on political influence, destabilization, and intelligence gathering efforts in Russia's near abroad, such as Ukraine, Belarus, and Central Asia. and it plays a key role in shaping Russia's covert foreign policy, often through disinformation, recruitment, and support of pro-Russian factions. The service has gained notoriety for its operations in Ukraine, and it's believed to have misled, obviously, the Kremlin leadership over an overly optimistic intelligence lead up to the 2022 invasion, which we mentioned just before. And then Bizarda has been involved in Ukraine-related operations for over a decade. He was present in Kyiv during the deadly Euromaidan protests in 2014. And Ukrainian officials claim he helped coordinate law enforcement attacks on protesters, and his presence during the period is confirmed by the SSB, though they downplay his role. Ukrainian intelligence also described Bizarda as persistent and dangerous adversary to Ukraine, accusing him of causing significant harm and continuing to participate in operations against the country even after his demotion. So despite being under Western sanctions and his controversial past, Bizarda now represents Russia in the recent US-Russia talks in Saudi Arabia. The discussions reportedly focus on the potential ceasefire efforts, while documents linked to his former service reveal maximalist Russian demands and a bleak outlook for peace in 2026. So my question is Bizarda today's Carla? Could be. Matt, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, this is I love these profiles of people, even just from like a fiction writer. These are very valuable when you get these little bits of detail and color and stuff that you can pull from and everything. It is interesting that the man who is perhaps second from Putin, the man who is perhaps, arguably the most responsible for the disaster that Russia has seen in Ukraine in recent years, what was supposed to be, a 3-day special military operation, as the joke now goes, is now, 1 million Russian soldiers dead and, a large part of their armed forces just incinerated, fighting over inches of Ukrainian fields, is now kind of quarterbacking the Russian ends of these negotiations. I don't know. I'm kind of surprised that Putin would pick that guy to do this. Perhaps Besida feels a need to sort of make amends and vindicate his honor for how poorly the first year or so of the invasion went. Yeah, it's an interesting story to have an intelligence officer sort of involved in these negotiations, but also, I mean, Bill Burns ran, ran negotiations for the sort of Middle East crises in the last year of the Obama administration. And I think I've said this before, I think did a much better job at handling that than the Secretary of State did at the time, Tony Blinken. But,
Well, indeed, yeah, as you're saying, it's not unusual for the presence of former intelligence officers to be involved in diplomatic talks. It was Peter Ernest, who's one of the late directors of the Spy Museum and former CIA officer, once said that espionage is sometimes best understood as an extension of diplomacy. And as you said, Bill Burns has been involved in all sorts of high-level talks. He was there negotiating with the Taliban to get US forces out.
Right.
And I think why it's interesting that you've got a kind of, should we say, a spy or an intelligence officer running things is, I guess, he has some sort of institutional knowledge about Russian interests in Ukraine. And so you kind of want somebody at the table who has that knowledge, who doesn't necessarily have to keep stopping the meeting to go and call up whoever to get that information. Can we give up this thing? Can we do that? And obviously it's been reported he's pushing this maximalist agenda and asking for all sorts of ridiculous things, which it's looking like at the moment Russia's probably going to get, or worse. It's
yeah, maybe we'll get into in the next story, but
maybe
I think those folks would claim otherwise, but
Well, yeah, it depends actually, because it depends if you think there is actually going to be a peace process, because at the moment, the way things are looking, it's very 50-50 whether the US are going to stay involved.
If there is a peace process, I think the guys that we're going to talk about next would not be happy with the deal if that's on the table right now, but
Well, yeah, totally. And, as J.D. Vance has sort of put out there, basically he's saying that Ukraine have got to accept giving up territory and not join NATO, etc. And it's like, well, how is this? There's any change to where we started many weeks ago when these negotiations, or supposed negotiations, even started? But that's a whole other thing. So I think despite Posada, who has had a contentious relationship with the Kremlin, especially over the faulty intelligence, which Putin famously berated him over, and led to his house arrest in 2022 for a short period of time. And then Posada officially retired from his post as head of the FSB's Fifth Service. He sort of stayed on, and he obviously has some political clout and confidence of President Putin to kind of handle these negotiations. So I do think it's probably he obviously has some sort of insider knowledge that's useful to this.
Posada almost certainly has been and is now involved in back channels with U.S. intelligence as well.
Yeah, indeed. So it's So with regards to the wider picture, there's another story that kind of stood out that doesn't directly relate to Posada, but it does sort of link into the Russian thinking a little bit, or maybe what's on Putin's agenda with regards to Ukraine. So there's a very interesting piece by New Lines magazine, one of our favorites, which is titled "The Russian Nationalists Pushing for Ukraine's Destruction." And I'm going to just summarize quickly below. Far-right groups such as the Russisch militia and the Russian imperial movement fight on Russia's behalf, but they're deeply critical of the state. So despite contributing to the war efforts, they distrust the Kremlin and fear repression once their utility ends. So Russian nationalist figures like Alexei Selevnov and Stanislav Vorobeyev, I hope I got that name right, view any ceasefire or territorial compromise of Ukraine as a betrayal of Russia's national interest. And they believe only in total victory, including dismantling Ukraine's sovereignty. And then leaders like Pavel Gubarev argue that oligarchic interests and political caution are preventing Russia from achieving victory, and they believe the war is being deliberately prolonged and that internal corruption undermines the military campaign. Some nationalist factions are turning their focus inward, targeting migrants and warning of civil conflict within Russia, and they blame lax immigration policies and postulate conspiracy theories about a population replacement, further radicalizing the far right. So, like I've said before, my concern is if the US do pull their support from pursuing a peace plan to end the war, I'm not seeing any impetus on the Russian side to stop their war. And it looks like, at least from Putin's side, he politically probably can't stop the war either, unless there's some pushback from the US and NATO to make it impossible for them to continue on. And it's at the moment looking like the US is going to cede ground to Putin, as many have suspected he would all along. So I don't know what your thoughts on all of that are.
Yeah, I'm gonna hold off on the terms of the Ukraine peace agreement that have been sort of offered up in the press in the past few days. Maybe that's something to work on next
might be next week.
Yeah. But I mean, far right nationalists are one of the few domestic pressure points left on Putin's rule in Russia. Some of the fiercest criticisms of the war inside Russia have come from Putin's right. Military bloggers on Telegram, people like Yevgeny Prigozhin, God rest his soul.
R.I.P. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So a lot of the criticisms against Putin's rule have come from those kinds of people who, as this article claims, are, saying we're not going, hard enough. It comes from this view that probably is still definitely Putin's view. It certainly was when he started the prosecution of this invasion, that that the Ukrainian identity of something that is separate from a Russian identity is a kind of recent Western fabrication aberration of history. It does not speak true to the long arc of Russian and Slavic history and kind of the way this part of the world has been ordered, right? They see Ukraine as an appendage, as a runaway, renegade, lost province that has to be, kind of smashed and essentially, ethnically cleansed to an extent. I think some of the stuff that they're talking about here in terms of, beating out the Ukrainian identity, whether that's the Ukrainian language, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, how Ukrainian children see themselves as, non-Russian, and not just doing that to, remember when this invasion started, not just applying that to the Crimea or the eastern provinces of Ukraine, which are, historically Russian speaking and have been under degree of Russian influence for over a decade now plus, but doing that to the entire country, I think that's certainly a form of ethnic cleansing, but that's also something that goal is not possible for the Russians. However this war ends, even if it does end with a surrender of the territory that Russia currently occupies, a recognition of Crimea and everything, Kyiv will not be a Russian city. Ukraine will still exist, a large part of Ukraine with coastline, mind you, which was also one of the objectives that got lost in the mix. They're going to keep Odessa. All of that is going to remain. And I think a lot of these folks, these sort of far right nationalist figures in Russia, as this article describes, I don't see how Russian state media will certainly try to spin it as a victory. And is it a net victory? Would it be a net victory for Putin? Would he have gained territory? Yes, but he will have come far short of extinguishing the idea of a Ukraine that is separate of Russia. They're not, according to the terms of this deal, I'm doing what I said we probably shouldn't do. According to the terms of this deal, Ukraine does get NATO membership, but they have the option open for EU membership. And in coming years, there's going to be a whole lot more coordination and defense spending within the EU itself. These are all ideas that, a couple of years ago would have been kind of unthinkable. So, that speaks back to recent intelligence estimates and everything that for a long time have all kind of concluded that Putin, no matter what he says, Putin is not interested in ending the war right now because he feels that he's winning. Also, I think I'm not inside Putin's head, but I think there has to be a part of him that's worried that if he does end the war now, freezes it along the lines of what territory they currently occupy, that he'll have a revolt to his right, that they'll see like, wait a second, we wanted to exterminate Ukraine as an idea itself, and we certainly have not done it. If anything, they have bolstered it for generations to come and irreversibly pushed Ukraine into the arms of the West.
Yeah. Well, time will tell whether there is a deal or not, because as of this airing, Trump has sort of put an ultimatum out saying that he's going to walk away. The US is going to walk away from any peace agreement unless as always, he's more critical of Ukraine than he is of Putin.
Yes, he is. Yes, he is.
He has expressed some annoyance at Putin, where he's asked Putin to stop bombing Ukraine.
Vladimir, stop! This isn't you.
I know. He said he's not happy with deadly Russian strikes on Kyiv.
Yeah.
I mean, many of us have not been happy about it for some time, so welcome to the club, President Trump. But so I don't know. I have zero faith in the Trump administration with resolving this in any positive way. And I do worry that we're going to watch Chechnya unfold again. So we'll see what happens. It's always been my biggest fear of Ukraine, is it would just turn into Chechnya and you'll just see Ukraine pummeled into the ground, and eventually some sort of stooge will take over and sort of turn it into a satellite state of Russia.
Yeah.
So we'll see what happens. I hope my prediction's wrong there, because I don't want to see that happen at all. But we will see. Maybe Trump can prove me wrong and come out with the best deal ever and make everybody happy, and
big, beautiful, perfect deal.
Exactly. That's what we want. Well, I think on that note, unless anything else on ads, no, we'll let's take a break, and then we'll come back with listener questions. Welcome back, everybody. So we've got some really great listener questions coming up now. So our first one is from Julie from Rhode Island, and she's got a question that has kind of sections to it. So she kindly says she really enjoys the podcast. So thank you, Julie. So her questions are about the feasibility of Europe delinking from the US defense. And she asks, are we talking about a matter of months, years, or decades? And there's a few specifics that she's curious about. So the first specific is, to what extent are individual European countries' defense capabilities intertwined with NATO and by extension the US? And if so, is it possible to kind of extricate themselves without formally dissolving the NATO alliance? Then the second part is, are there viable alternatives to US weapon systems like the Eutelsat as seen as a Starlink substitute? And then is it feasible, the third thing is it feasible to maintain operability of existing US systems without continued American support? So, Matt, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, thank you for your question, Julie. I mean, European militaries are certainly heavily intertwined with the U.S. military, not to the extent that they're just unable to operate without the U.S., but it does get prohibitively more difficult depending on the size and length of the operation, that Europe would want to do on their own. I mean, especially when you consider, issues of like intelligence gathering and logistics, especially signals intelligence. I mean, I'm thinking back to the 2011 intervention in Libya that exposed significant limitations in the supply and logistics capabilities of European NATO members. I mean, after not very long at all, a week or two, maybe a little bit more, European militaries were, unable to would have been unable to keep pace with those operations without U.S. supply lines, airlift, aerial refueling, sea logistics and everything. And that's, operating against Gaddafi's Libya right across the Mediterranean, right in Europe's backyard. And now, of course, that was in 2011. Europe has come a long way since then, for sure. Since the 2014 seizure of Crimea, definitely. Since the full invasion of Ukraine, Europe's come a long way. They're going to come much further in years to come. So that's important to give them credit for that. As far as their dependence on, I don't know, like there was some, discussion like there's a kill switch in the F-35s and everything that are operated by European militaries or anything, or they can the U.S. can remotely take control of them. That's not true. There is no kill switch in the F-35. I mean, yeah, they're going to rely on, Lockheed for, maintenance, spare parts, maintainers, and of course, software updates and everything. When, without those, it gets harder to operate F-35s in the long run, but it's not as if there's a kill switch. And to my knowledge, that has not been threatened at all to withhold that support from Europe. I don't know. It's also sort of reminds me of like a lot of supporters of, Trump's tariffs and everything, to sort of, I think, wrongly believe that this massive manufacturing capacity can just be onshore to the U.S. in a matter of months or a year without great difficulties or adverse consequences. I think there is some well-meaning European commentary that sort of also thinks that, Europe can just quickly kind of spin itself off from the U.S. In no time. I mean, apart from, I think that would be a massive gift to Trump and Putin to do that anyway. It's going to be a long few years, but I'm not willing to play taps for NATO just yet.
No. Well, this is it. I think this would be the worst case scenario.
It would be, yeah.
So I'll just do my best to answer my bits here as well, because it's quite a complicated thing. But I really do, hope that this isn't going to be the future, and this is the worst case scenario. But obviously, I think some of the Trump administration, all this sort of uncertainty, has brought at least one healthy thing, which is that Europe are now trying to work out how they can actually look after themselves without US support, because I think, as you said many a time, there's a feeling in the US that you guys have sort of carried the burden for European peace for a very long time, and yet Europe are kind of benefiting a little bit, with regards to the lack of tax burden in some areas. So,
and for a period of time, 90s, early 2000s stuff, even through the war on terror and everything, the world was to an extent where that was sustainable, that was doable to a bit, but we're not in that world anymore, you know? And I've talked about scenarios on here before where, you know, a potential third world war scenario where you're fighting Russia and China all at once, where, you know, scenarios where we can't come defend the Baltics because we're bogged down all over the Pacific. And that's something that I in my bones do not believe that is an extreme request to say, hey, you guys got to hold the Baltics for a bit because we're at war with China.
No.
You know?
Exactly, and it's on our doorstep, and we've got the experience, the territory, etc.
Absolutely.
But I think for Europe to de-link from the US military would take decades.
Yeah.
It's a combination of things. First, we've got to build up defensive and offensive capabilities, which will require significant investment. You know, we've seen early signs now from the UK and Germany who have pledged to invest more in defense and their NATO obligations, which is all good. Then there's the political will to actually do this, what it would look like. I suspect the consensus might start to wane as Europe is obviously full of countries that have deep historical and political concerns. And I think it takes a powerful outsider like the US to act as a kind of power broker. So once the US is out of the picture, you may start to find France, Germany, and UK may take the lead on certain things. And that might lead to resentment from other countries. That's sort of traditionally kind of how it's gone in the past with European situations. And then Europe is not immune to the political winds that brought us Trump.
Yes.
So the situation we're in today, there are been lots of gains by the far right and populist movements in Europe. And likewise, there's a rising far left who are kind of rising in response to the far right. The far left would likely want to reduce defense spending, and then the far right will either be isolationist or less cooperative with other nations, or worse, they could become power hungry and start abusing their positions of power. And we might start seeing small conflicts break out, which God forbid I hope doesn't happen, but it's not impossible. It's happened in the past. Then with regards to your second concern, which is about the weapons systems. So the US, in regards to its 5th and 6th generation fighter technology, are the leaders in the world on this. But European aircraft manufacturers are currently behind on that technology, but there is a wealth of experience. And if the will and the budgets are in place, they might be able to challenge that. They might be able to build their own 6th gen fighters that could compete with or be better than US ones. With regards to 5th gen stuff, I mean, there have recently been talks in European countries and even Canada of cancelling their F-35 orders and going with the Saab Gripen E, which is a very capable fighter. And there's a link I'll give you to Matt to put in the show notes about the Gripen E. And it has some positives and negatives with regards to the F-35. I think there's a debate open about which one's actually better, but they're pretty capable aircraft, both of them. And then Europe has a shortage of defensive missiles, artillery shells, and very few of its own nuclear-armed weapons that have not been supplied by the US or work in tandem with US systems. As far as I know, I think the French nuclear system is the only truly independent nuclear system in Europe. I could be wrong, but that's from what I saw.
That's true.
And then, again, as I mentioned, the political will to do something about rebuilding the nuclear arsenal is an issue. Because in the UK, we always get into very silly public debates about our own nuclear deterrent and its replacement, in which those who favour an upgrade get equated with warmongers. And then there are some politicians who seem only to be able to deal with one threat at a time. So in 2010, the then leader of the Liberal Democrats, Nick Clegg, believed we no longer needed nuclear defense because the biggest threat was terrorism and not nation states.
Yeah.
But historians and recent history has shown us that threats change, and there's usually more than one type of threat. And as I said, it's now, I mean, there's a lot of information talk about the rise of ISIS. You've already got into that earlier this year on the podcast. ISIS have not gone away. We just don't talk about them. And there's even talk of America pulling embassies out of Africa, which could lead to a huge blind spot because Africa is the hot spot for ISIS right now. But that's probably for next week.
More groups than just ISIS, yeah.
Yeah, totally. So that's a whole other thing there. So, this is the problem. I think a lot of political leaders get swayed, and the public too just gets swayed by whatever's the loudest issue. And obviously terrorism for a long time was the loudest issue, but it's not the only issue. So I think the political will is always the problem here. Obviously, all this provides a lot of opportunity for European companies and countries to step up and resolve these capability gaps. And you mentioned Eutelstat, and Eutelstat is particularly, it's sort of could be seen as an alternative to Starlink, and through its partnership with OneWeb, it is emerging as a viable European alternative now. And it does have some trade-offs. So Starlink offers low latency and high-speed internet in its low-orbit satellites, whilst Eutelstat combines traditional geostationary coverage. And what that means is the satellite stays in a fixed position going around with the planet, and it means it can provide strong regional coverage across Europe, Africa, and parts of the Middle East. So, so there are things kind of in the works that might well start to fill certain gaps from US companies. Now, your third point, hang on, what was your third point again? Your third point was, is it feasible to maintain operability of US systems? So there's something you brought up just earlier about this kill switch, because that's a big debate in Europe at the moment. So you said it's not true and it might not be, but apparently Germany held closed door discussions about whether there's a kill switch in fighter jets and in the software. So it's like, I don't know, because I've heard this, and I haven't seen anything either way to confirm it or to say there isn't one, but it did lead to this discussion about the Gripen E.
If we're looking at unclassified sources, there is no kill switch. I would think a remote software kill switch would be a vulnerability for a cyber attack that you would want to avoid in the design in the first place, but also define kill switch. If you define a kill switch as you cut off maintenance support or software updates, it's a kill switch. But I don't think there's a button in the Pentagon somewhere that says, if I push this button, every European F-35 is going to fall out of the sky. That I don't think exists.
No. Well, no. And it would be, I think also European intelligence services would have done their homework to check if that's the case or not. But we will see on that one. But certainly there's been concerns in Europe about that. But to your other point about parts, look at Iran and their use of the F-14 Tomcat and US aircraft from the 70s. You kind of can cobble stuff together, but they're not very effective anymore.
Those F-14s would be destroyed in the first hours of a conflict anyway. But totally. They have managed, for the F-14s that they have managed to keep them running. The Iranian Air Force uses those F-14s to they're earmarked to defend their nuclear facilities.
Yeah, indeed. So anyways, all of that, I hope it's all the worst case scenario, because we've said this in the past. I think a lot of this division does play into the hands of Vladimir Putin. Absolutely. And I'm, for one, deeply concerned about the kind of cost of the next 4 years with Trump at the helm. With his discussions of annexing Greenland, Canada, and building a resource in Gaza. I think if the US did take Greenland by force, which I will say now I hope is very unlikely, but I'm going to place it as a medium possibility right now, the way I feel about it. But I don't know how you feel about that, but it feels like a medium to me.
Less than medium, I would say.
Less than medium. Okay, cool. Yeah. That's good. We should put it on the Nando's scale, shouldn't we, of the flavors at Nando's? Have you ever been to a Nando's?
Not in many years, but yeah. We don't have them here.
So hopefully that does never happen. But if it did happen, that would take a wrecking ball to NATO and US-EU relations.
That would be it.
That would be a disaster. So I totally understand, everybody's sort of interest and concerned about Europe and America right now, because I share that concern too. It's worrying. So I really hope this worst case scenario doesn't happen.
My concern, and we've talked about this before in previous episodes, my concern has been that a lot of this talk and rumination has the danger of becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy after a while.
Yes.
And also, to your point, Putin and, the sort of nationalist MAGA forces behind Trump would love nothing more than for Europe to just get up and leave themselves, right? It's going to be a long and frustrating 4 years. It's going to be a very annoying 4 years. But, to your point, you made this claim earlier, the runway that it would take for Europe to completely spin itself off is longer than Trump is going to be around, whether that's in 4 years through normal political constitutional means, or a bit longer through more natural means. He's not going to be around forever, and he does not. it would take Europe longer to fully spin itself off than he's going to be around. However he leaves the scene.
Indeed, indeed. Well, thank you, Julie, for that. We'll move on to Sam from Finland, who has a question. So, Sam's a frequent listener from Finland, so thank you, Sam. And
Hi, Sam.
he asks, are there a lot of Bulgarian spies operating for Russia and Europe, or are they just unprofessionals who have been caught and therefore seen often in the headlines? And then if there are a lot of Bulgarian spies for Russia, why is Russia recruiting especially Bulgarians as spies? So Matt, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I do. I had a whole bunch of notes on this for when we discussed that UK Bulgarian spy ring a couple weeks ago. We ran out of time on the show, didn't have time to get into it. But so I went back and I dug up those notes, and here's what I got for you. That practice of using Bulgarian nationals as intelligence assets goes back decades, back to the Cold War era cooperation between the KGB and Bulgarian state security. Bulgaria was one of the Soviets' most loyal Eastern Bloc satellite states. So some of those key factors that have made Bulgarians attractive to Russian intelligence over the years. So, during the Cold War, the Bulgarian state security was called the KGB's little brother, acted as surrogate for the KGB, handling stuff that the Soviets wanted deniability from. So one example of that would be the assassination of Georgy Markov was that Waterloo Bridge in London?
It was Waterloo Bridge, with the
getting on a
umbrella
bus,
and
getting on a bus going over Waterloo Bridge with the tip of the umbrella that was
poked
ricin?
in the ankle, I think it was, and it was ricin,
ricin, and right. So that was the Bulgarians.
Take you to the bus stop next time you come to London.
Oh, definitely for sure. That's one example of this sort of thing. There's also Bulgaria's strategic position in Europe. So nowadays, former Eastern Bloc country, of course, sits at an important, crossroads between Russia, the Balkans, Turkey, the EU. Since joining NATO and the EU, Bulgaria has become a prime target for Russian infiltration and influence operation. I think it's just sort of seen as like the soft underbelly for Europe. The Russian intelligence has this kind of, institutional memory and long-running cultural kind of connections, I guess, with certain Bulgarian networks and everything. And nowadays, those folks have EU passports and can easily travel about Europe, visa free, border check free, at least within the Schengen zone. So it's just sort of these are old contractors that the Soviets have used for a long time for a number of sort of cultural, geographic reasons. Yeah,
part of Carla's Black Book.
Yes.
Yeah. No, totally. One thing I was going to say on this one actually was, obviously Bulgarian nationals are heavily involved, but let's not forget the Moldovans as well.
Sure.
They've also become a favorite of recruitment for espionage and sabotage. And just before the Olympics in Paris last year, there was a Moldovan man who was arrested in a flat in Paris, and he had explosives and all sorts of stuff. And Moldova's espionage efforts are kind of similar to the Bulgarian one. There is a sort of deep history there. And then recently, Russian espionage efforts have been intertwined with attempts to exert political influence and destabilize the pro-European government. And the presence of Russian military forces in the breakaway region of Transnistria provides a strategic foothold for intelligence operations, and former President Igor Dodon currently faces charges of treason after evidence emerged of his communications with Russian security officials and accepting funds from pro-Russian oligarchs. Moldovan authorities have dismantled spy networks orchestrated by Russian agents. And so these operations include spreading disinformation, organizing protests to undermine public trust in state institutions, and obviously they've been involved in some of these sort of sabotage operations that are kind of going on at the moment. So I think Bulgaria and Moldova should be considered with regards to this. And I'm hoping, I'm in the works at the moment on a Bulgarian spy special soon with Florian Vlada. So hopefully that'll be coming up in the next sort of few weeks.
Cool.
Negotiating that currently. So there may be more to follow this. And one last thing, there's an interesting article by Mark Kramer for Harvard University titled "A weak link in NATO, Bulgaria, Russia, and the lure of espionage. I'll put that in the show notes as well. I won't summarize it, but there's some very interesting stuff in there. It's from 2021, but the majority of it's still quite relevant. So there's a bit of further reading on Bulgaria and its sort of history of all this. So we'll move on to our final question, but thank you very much, Sam, for that. That was really good. So our final one is from Richard in the UK. So thank you, Richard. He's seen a few articles about Hungary being expected to take Russia's side within the EU and an attempt to block or water down ongoing efforts to put pressure on Russia. Is there a sense that Hungary is Russia's inside man, or do Hungarians' interests just simply align with Russia's? And secondly, whereas the UK voluntarily left the EU, does the EU have any mechanism for expelling or suspending members? So, Matt, I don't know if you had any thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, Hungary under Orbán has been described as an illiberal democracy. Comes into power through democratic means and then uses the democratic system to subvert itself, to subvert that system and make it much harder to be removed through democratic means, which I think is especially shitty. Just do a coup, the old-fashioned way, if that's how you want to go. But yeah, I mean, they're part of Orbánism is part of the same kind of, far-right nationalist movement that Putinism is a part of, that the MAGA movement is a part of. They're all kind of the same confederation, I guess you could say. And yeah, it certainly has been a thorn in the side of Brussels for a while. Orbán has officially condemned the invasion of Ukraine, but his actions, like lobbying to remove Russian oligarchs from sanctions lists and staging these sort of solo peace missions or whatever, align with the Kremlin's interests for sure, and definitely undermine EU unity. It's an issue in NATO as well, of course. NATO decision making. Chris, did I lose you? Oh no, okay. You were holding very still for a minute. I thought you had frozen. If I was a dinosaur, I wouldn't have even seen you there.
My sniper training.
Anyway, where was I? Yeah, so it's been an issue for NATO as well at times. NATO officially, their decision-making process, it runs on consensus, so every member has to agree, or at least every member has to agree on a proposal, or at least agree not to object to it, right? That's called the silence procedure. I won't get more nerdy on NATO's decision-making than that. But anyway, some argue that Hungary's alignment, of course, is more, opportunistic than conspiratorial. As far as what the EU can do about it, so the EU has no mechanism to expel a member state. Even suspending Hungary's voting rights under Article 7 requires unanimous support from other members, which is something Hungary has so far avoided thanks to political allies within the Union, such as Slovakia. So a radical alternative that was sort of floated, and this is purely hypothetical, it's not going to happen, would be to invoke for every other EU member other than Hungary to invoke Article 50, which is the Brexit clause. So essentially is this is crazy. When I read this, I was like, this is insane. Every EU member
dissolve the EU and start a new one.
Right. You would basically say, we're going to close this EU and we're going to start another one without Hungary in it.
EU 2.0.
That's the only way you could, right. That's the only way you could procedurally.
Could Britain join that?
Call up here.
Oh God! Who suggested that?
But if you're looking for a,
let's talk about the nuclear option,
right?
Yeah.
That's yes. If you're looking for a procedural way to get Hungary out without it choosing to leave, that's it. You would have to nuke the EU and start up, reboot it.
Wow.
Without Hungary.
Wow.
That's it. So it's unfortunate. I mean, I was my sort of hypothetical, dream sort of situation for current geopolitical issues that I was thinking of, back in the summer and the fall and stuff when, if the election went another way, I'm thinking, yeah, we gotta do something about Orbán. That's an issue. That's a serious weak point in NATO. I mean, you're not going to have U.S. support to do that. If anything, I think if Brussels got serious about really punishing Orbán, you're going to have the Trump administration, pissing in the tent from the outside. Anyway, Orban's Hungary is an issue. It is frustrating. It is concerning. It is, we've talked about issues, stories of, him inviting Chinese state security in to sort of, use Hungary as a base to spy on Chinese dissidents throughout Europe. I think that's a huge issue that is not taken seriously nearly enough. But procedurally within the EU, the way it's constituted, there's nothing realistically that you can do about it if Hungary does not choose to leave on its own. So it's a problem.
Yeah. So as you said, there's no formal mechanism to remove a country from the EU, and the reason is because they're worried that mechanism could undermine the EU's legitimacy and open a door to political abuse or trigger massive legal and constitutional complications.
Right.
The most serious thing they have is a tool called Article 7, which allows the EU to warn a member state of violating kind of core EU values, and they can suspend certain rights, such as you were saying earlier about voting rights in the EU Council. And apparently this has been triggered against Poland and Hungary in the past, but full sanctions require unanimous agreement, and obviously if one member has partners or allies that can undermine that. So it's a bit of an issue. I think the whole idea of nuking the EU and starting a new one is in some ways a bad idea, because the thing is, yes, Hungary under Orbán is a problem, but hopefully things might change, and there is some glimmer of hope at the moment.
Great point.
Because it's the thing, isn't it? If we just expel people because we don't like them all the time, it becomes this, then we could let them back in, then we kick them out,
Right.
and it just becomes a bit dysfunctional, doesn't it? It's
Yeah.
tricky. It's a bit like family.
Well,
it's tricky sometimes.
It's also, I think, honestly, it's a way of, and I've asked European listeners of this podcast to look at the U.S. in the same way, a couple weeks ago when we were talking about this, in the sense that, yeah, you may be pissed off at the government and at the top, and you have every right to do so, but don't ignore the pushback and the feeling of ordinary people within that country that are trying to push back and say, this is not what we want, this is not who we stand for, and we're not going to let you be in power forever. That's happening here in the U.S. all the time, picking up more so now. And I think, as you were saying, that's happening in Hungary also, So, I mean, yeah, Orbán would love nothing more than the Western club to, kick him out so he can fully align himself with Putin and everything. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, the greatest opponents at Orbán was a man named Peter Magyar, and I hope I got his name correct there. And he sort of positioned himself, as a clear contrast to Orbán, especially in foreign policy, and he's expressed strong support for the EU, and he's calling for a return to democratic norms and closer ties with Brussels. Unlike Orbán, who has maintained friendly relations with Russia and often clashes with the EU, Magyar has criticized the government's alignment with Moscow and its confrontational stance towards the EU. So, the 2026 election will be one to keep an eye on. I would expect significant Russian influence operations, as I suspect they'll want to not lose Orbán. And you may also see some money from America connected to MAGA giving support for Orbán as well.
You should expect J.D. Vance to get involved in that. And, people like, I don't know how much political capital Musk is going to have in 2026. It's dwindling rapidly right now, but
Good.
Thank God. But yeah, you will definitely see far-right U.S. personalities try to influence that, for sure.
Oh, yeah, totally. And I don't know if it'll go as far as Fox News and stuff supporting Orbán or something, but be one to keep an eye on. So,
Tucker Carlson will.
Yeah.
Openly. Steve Bannon will. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. So there is a glimmer of hope, but the glimmer of hope is like a candle. it depending on which way the wind's going, could either keep the flame going or blow it out. But we'll see how that goes.
Definitely.
So, thank you, Julie, Sam, and Richard, for your questions there. And we'll definitely do this again next month. So please send us an email to secretsandspiespodcast@gmail.com or DM us on our social channels. Just in your message, include your question or topic. And if it's a topic with a relevant news or online publication link, and also let us know how you'd like us to read out your name and location online, because I don't want to give anything away accidentally. So that is us done for today. So thank you very much, Matt. And
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody, for listening. Obviously, if you enjoyed these episodes, please share them. The more you share them, the more new people come and listen to it, and the more that helps us keep going. So thank you. And if you want to go ad-free, please go to patreon.com/secretsandspies. And you can select what level works best for you, and then you'll get free access to all our episodes that are ad-free. We also have a merchandise store where you can buy a really cool Secrets and Spies cup, or tote bag, water bottles, and even coasters. And if you go to redbubble.com, if you go to the link in our show notes, you can do that. And also we're on YouTube. Please support our YouTube page. Just go to Secrets and Spies Podcast on YouTube and you'll find us there. As I say, all the links in the show notes, as are our social media links as well on Bluesky, etc. So thank you very much, Matt, for your time today.
Thank you.
And thank you, everybody, for listening. And we will catch you on the next one. Take care.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. This is Secrets and Spies.